Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now, to my mind, the Sherman is the iconic vehicle of the Second World War. You can keep your Panthers and your T-34s. The M4 Sherman is where it's at. Now, recently, Battlefront released a new plastic kit for the Sherman, which has a few options in there, and I'll talk about that very briefly. But I want to show you how I've painted this one here, because it is super simple to get a very quick and I think quite striking result for the table. So as always, all of the paints for this one will be listed in the description below, and there's not many on this one. Let's get started. So what I've got in front of me today is one of the new plastic kits from Battlefront for the Sherman, and I was actually really surprised by how many bits it came with. Almost every conceivable weapon combination and mantlet is in there. And there was even a hull here for the M4A2, which the Sherman 3 in British service. It didn't see any use with the US Army, but it was used in limited numbers by the Marines in the Pacific. So I've popped the M4A2 hull on because it's cool, and you don't see many of them painted up in American colors, and that's what we're going to do today. Really neat little kit, and like I said, really stunned by the number of bits that came with it. However you do assemble it though, next thing to do is to prime it. And here I've used the US Olive Drab spray from Vallejo. Now this is purely because it is the easiest thing going and it's the right color. If you do need to use something else, you find it difficult to get those primers, what you can do would be to spray it with a gray. Any gray will do the job, and then just give it a couple of thin coats of US Olive Drab from the bottle, the painted version. Just pop it on with a nice big brush. You are going to need that color anyway, and I'll show you why. Now first of all, I don't actually have any decals for this set, so I'm going to have to hand paint my white stars. What I'm using here is Corax white from CITADEL, but don't worry too much. White is white. What we'll do is kind of vaguely at first start sketching on a star shape, and I'm not too worried if it isn't perfect. I always kind of find at this scale, slightly imperfect has a kind of charm to it. So let's start painting in the star as best we can, but I'm not worried too much if I do make a big blob of it, because once I've finished putting in this, we can then use that US Olive Drab from the pot to get in there and just tidy it up a little bit. And I've over-tidied on that side. Well, luckily, I've messed up this one good and proper. So let's get in and make this a little more reasonable. And you can do this for pretty much anything that you need to hand paint at this point. Now, I am rushing this a little bit because I'm just painting for the channel here. You can take a little more time and get a nicer result if you fancy. You'll notice as well, they aren't the same size, but your opponent can't see both sides of a turret at the same time, so don't worry about it. Obviously, decals are going to be much easier though if you have got those, but I figured it would be useful just to show you, it's not a big deal if you haven't got them. What we'll do now to add a bit of depth is to shade the miniature. And what I'm going to use, this is the new Vallejo Game Color Wash Umber. Now they've recently changed the formula, so make sure that you are getting the new bottle. It's got a little red ring around the cap. And as well, there is both a wash and an ink version, so make sure you're getting the wash. What I'll use is a nice big flat brush, tends to be the easiest for this, and we're just going to sweep it across the miniature, making sure that it gets into all of the recesses. If you keep your brush moving in the same direction as much as possible, you'll get rid of some of the brush strokes as well. You can be quite generous with it. Just move it around while it's still wet, and then once you've got it all on, leave this for about half an hour to dry. Now once that has dried, you're going to have something that looks like this. And the benefit to using the Game Color Wash is that these new formulations dry super matte. You could use instead Corax Earthshade or something like Strong Tone from the Army Painter, but I do love that matte finish. That's so easy. It also doesn't cover over those stars terribly badly, so that's a handy one to have. I'm going to pop the tank off of the little painting jig now, because now we're going to dry brush it. What I have is a nice soft makeup brush of all things. These are super useful for dry brushing. And we're going to use a little bit of Khaki from Vallejo. Now this is the model color version. If you're painting British armor, then something like Middlestone will usually work quite well because it's got a slightly greener finish. But with just a little bit of Khaki, what we'll do is flick along the edges of details. So sort of a 45-degree angle to the hull for a while. And as you see how much you're leaving behind, you can go over other details. So the engine deck, for example, that's always a good spot to pick out. That raised detail. It is possible to go overboard with this, but try not to worry too much. Be a little brave, because as it dries, it will darken down. As well, you can grip it like so, and make sure you're filling in the running gear as well with this. And that's more or less finished. Let's slap that on the table. But of course we want to paint in the tracks as well, and some of the other small tools and what have you. So what I've got here is German Grey. Now this is another Vallejo color, and it's a very dark blue-black. Let's pop the turret off again. Now what I have here, this is a little flat brush from the stationery aisle. As long as it stays flat, it's generally pretty easy to paint the tracks. Some folks will insist the easiest way to paint these is by leaving them off the tank and painting them separately and gluing them on later, but you don't need to get right up under where you're not going to see. So a quick coat of this, and as well on all of the gear down here. And I am going to swap to a smaller, slightly pointier brush, and I'll paint in the rubber wheels and a few little bits like the MG and what have you as well. Now that looks a little more reasonable. We're really starting to get somewhere. I'm going to add a little bit of beige brown here to the handles on the wooden tools, or rather the wooden handles on the metal tools. Those tools aren't made of wood. That would not make them very strong at all. Now aside from a couple of silver details along the sides of the tracks, that's pretty much done. But before we do those, we are actually going to weather the vehicle. So as always, let's pop the turret off. What I've got is a little bit of packing foam here from an old blister, just tugged to pieces and then folded over in a nice pair of tweezers. What I'm going to do is dip it into a little bit of German Camo Black Brown, which is quite a mouthful, and then just dab it across my palette a few times until I'm not leaving very much behind. Then what we'll do is start dabbing it along edges and corners that are likely to see a little bit of wear. Try not to go too heavy with this because you don't want to completely obliterate your dry brushing, but focusing on areas that would see a lot of traffic, so where the crew are going to be handling the tank, climbing into and out of it and stuff. And this is part of the reason why if you've got decals on your vehicle, you should apply them before this stage too. So up here is probably a good spot. Anyhow, as much of this as you want to add, or as little, away you go. Now it is quite easy to go overboard with that, so mind how you go. Bear in mind it's always better to have too little of this than it is too much. What I'm doing now is adding a whole mess of water to some red leather. You see I've thinned that out until that's basically a wash. Now in reality, most vehicles wouldn't have a lot of time to actually get rusty. It would be fairly subtle in appearance, and in particular American vehicles that were quite regularly maintained, you wouldn't see this sort of collecting on them. But we aren't painting a real tank, we're painting a scale miniature that's going to look cool on a table. So, with a little bit of this red leather mix, what we want to aim for is areas where water would collect and there'd be a little bit of time for some rust to build up. Go sparing with it, especially your first time. And as well, too much water in your rust mix will always be better than not enough, because if you find it dries and it's not really showing up, you can add another coat versus just putting something on that's too thick in the first place rather. Now the real benefit of that is in having just a little bit of warmth on what can otherwise be quite a flat color scheme. Again, not necessarily strictly accurate, but we are painting for something to look cool. So what I have lurking here, this is a B pencil, something nice and soft normally works best for this. What I'm going to do is just take the edge of the lead and buff it along the edges where there's been any damage. Now this will be quite subtle when you first apply it, but you can go over it a few times and really work it until it shines. The more of this you apply, the more recent and fresh those scratches are going to look. The other thing that's really useful about this is you can just buff along the edges. You hear that buzzing? Buzz the edges of the tracks, and there's the silver on those as well. Now that's pretty much done, but we can go a little bit further. I'll take the turret off, and what I have here is some brown sand. And again, one of my funky little makeup brushes. This one's got a little bit more spring in the bristles, so a traditional dry brush will also work quite well here. You'll see I'm working most of it off, and a bit of clean white paper will work quite well here. We do want it to be a little bit chalky when we apply this. What I'm going to do is start just jabbing along the running gear to start with, and building up slowly a little bit of that dusty color. As always, too little to start with is going to be better than too much. You can be as sparing with this, or as dusty as you like. Take your time and make sure that you are working it into the running gear and up along the edges of the hull just a little. Particularly on the tracks, make sure that they're dusty too. I do hope that's actually visible on camera, but particularly around the front, you can spend a bit of time building that up and getting a nice sort of gradient of color there. As always, too little paint at a time is way better. What I've got next, and this is really the final stage, this is dark sand. And importantly, the very softest brush I could find. What I'm going to do is the same again, work most of this off of my brush. What we want to do with this is catch upper parts of the hull where dry dust is likely to collect. You can also flick along the tracks and stuff with this too, but be very sparing with it. Don't forget, since we are doing the settled dry dust from above, a little bit of this on your turret is going to look good too. And there at last, our Sherman tank is ready for the table. It only just now occurs to me that since I was planning on putting this one down on for the Pacific, maybe that little bit of extra rust would actually be more thematically appropriate. Conditions would be right there, I guess. So thank you again to Battlefront for sending these along for me to have a play with. That new kit really is very nice, and the sheer number of options in there is pretty ridiculous. As always as well, thank you very much to Exit 23 Games for the light and sound equipment, as well as all of the wonderful patrons who are keeping me ticking in my paints and glue, including producers Alan Nuttall, Kyrie Crawford, Rod, Andrew, and Jimmy. Your support means the world, folks. Any questions or anything, feel free to drop them in the old comment box below. My Twitter and Instagram are both linked there too. So thank you very much for your time, one and all, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.